My husband told me, "Don't embarrass me. You're too plain for my wealthy colleagues. Know your place." I nodded silently. I smiled and said, "Of course." A week later, he nearly choked when I walked into his private club as the owner. His so-called friends bowed to the woman he had once scorned. "Don't embarrass me tonight. You're too plain for my wealthy colleagues. Know your place." Charles uttered these words while adjusting his Hermes tie in the mirror of our Upper East Side bedroom, speaking as casually as he would comment on the weather. I stood behind him, holding the cocktail dress I was about to wear for his dinner at the Centurion Club, searching his reflection for any sign that he recognized the cruelty of what he'd just said. There was none. He simply continued knotting his tie, oblivious to the fact that his plain wife had personally approved every single one of his colleagues' memberships to the very club where tonight's dinner would be held, that the building they revered as a temple of success had my name, Sophia Prescott, on the deed. I hung the dress back in the closet with deliberate, calm movements. "Of course," I said. "I understand." He smiled then, that self-satisfied look he got when a negotiation went his way. "Good. These clients from Monterey are expecting a certain standard. Morgan's wife spent 2 hours at the salon today just for this dinner. Montgomery's flew to Paris last week for a new gown." He turned from the mirror to face me directly. "You have to understand, Sophia. At this level, appearances matter. First impressions are everything." 4 years of marriage, and he still believed I didn't grasp basic social concepts. I wanted to tell him that I had watched those same wives flounder in small talk at a dozen events, their salon-perfect hair and designer clothes unable to mask their desperate need for approval. Instead, I straightened his already perfect tie, playing the part he'd assigned me since our wedding day. "What time will you be home?" I asked. "Late. These dinners run long, especially when we're closing deals." He checked his Rolex, the one he'd bought to impress Morgan, not knowing that Morgan's was a counterfeit I had chosen to overlook when reviewing his membership application. "There's leftover lasagna in the fridge if you get hungry." The lasagna from 3 nights ago, when he'd ordered from that Soho Italian place that charged $40 for a basic cacio e pepe because they delivered to Centurion Club members. He'd barely eaten half his portion, complaining the sauce was too acidic, while I finished my sandwich from the corner deli. After he left, trailing a scent of cologne that cost more than our monthly utilities, I sat at our small dining table and opened my laptop not to check our bank balance or browse social media, but to review the quarterly reports for the Prescott Legacy Group, LLC, the conglomerate my grandmother had built from nothing. The empire she had raised while men like Charles treated her like part of the furniture in their boardrooms. My phone vibrated with a text from Marcus Thorne, the general manager of the club. "Mrs. Davies, tonight's dinner is proceeding as planned. Your husband's table is set for 12. Maintaining standard protocol." Standard protocol meant treating me like a ghost when Charles was present, pretending the owner of the establishment didn't exist. I had maintained this charade for 3 years, watching Charles strut around my building while telling people his wife worked in admin with a dismissive wave that suggested I filed papers for a living. "Yes," I texted back. The apartment felt smaller after Charles left. Or maybe it just felt more honest. Without his presence, demanding space, requiring attention, needing constant validation that he was climbing the right ladder fast enough, I could breathe. I went to our bedroom closet and pushed aside the row of Charles's suits, Tom Ford, Zegna, Armani, to get to the back wall, where I kept a single garment bag he'd never noticed. Inside hung a vintage Oscar de la Renta gown my grandmother had bought in 1982, the year she cleared her first $1 million. She'd worn it exactly once, to a shareholder meeting where she seized majority control of her first commercial property. "Save it," she'd told me during those last weeks in the hospital. "Wear it on the day you stop hiding." I ran my fingers over the fabric. Still perfect after all these years. Charles would call it plain, black, simple lines, no embellishments. He wouldn't understand that its power was in its simplicity, that the woman wearing it needed no decoration to command a room. My phone rang. It was Isabel, my cousin. Her name flashed over a picture from better times, before her husband turned their marriage into a transaction, and she turned her pain into Lexapro and Napa Cabernet. "I need to see you," she said, no preamble. "Robert's done it again. I found receipts." "I'm sorry. Charles has a dinner at the club." "Where else?" She laughed, but it was bitter. You're so lucky to be married to someone important enough for the Centurion Club. I bit my tongue to keep from pointing out the irony. Isabel arrived 20 minutes later. Her Loewe handbag was worth more than our rent, but her face showed the kind of exhaustion money couldn't fix. She collapsed onto our second-hand sofa, the one Charles complained about whenever we had company, and started crying before she even took off her coat. 23 years old, she said between sobs. His personal trainer. Can you believe it? I'm 42, Sophia. When did I become the disposable wife? I sat beside her, offering tissues and silence. There were no good words for this moment, no comfort that wouldn't sound hollow. Isabel had married Robert for love, or what she thought was love, and discovered too late that he'd married her for her family trust and connections. Robert doesn't even hide it anymore, Isabel continued. He takes her to lunch at the club, books the private dining room. The entire staff knows. They give me these pitying looks when I'm there. My club staff, witnessing the destruction of my cousin's marriage in my private dining room, I made a mental note to review Robert's membership status. Standards had to be maintained, even if Charles didn't think I understood such concepts. What are you going to do? I asked. Leave him. Take what I can in the divorce and start over. She looked around our apartment, taking in the worn furniture, the cramped space, the absence of luxury. You're lucky, you know. Charles may not be rich, but at least he comes home to you. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Charles came home to the idea of me, the convenient wife who kept his life organized while staying out of his real world. But Isabel didn't need my problems tonight. She needed my sofa, my silence, and my promise not to judge her for whatever came next. When she left, I stood by our bedroom window, watching the lights of Manhattan glitter below. Somewhere out there, Charles was sitting in my club, at my table, surrounded by people who owed their membership to my approval, telling them his wife was too plain for their company. The thought should have hurt, but instead, it crystallized something that had been forming since I found my grandmother's will. Being underestimated was a weapon, but only if you knew when to reveal your true power. Tonight was not that night, but soon, very soon, Charles would learn that the plain wife he scorned owned the kingdom he was so desperate to conquer. Monday morning arrived with Charles already at the office, leaving only the lingering scent of his cologne and a note reminding me to pick up his suits from the dry cleaner. Mrs. Gable's shop was 3 blocks from our apartment, wedged between a tapas bar and a decaying bookstore, the kind of neighborhood Charles called transitional, when explaining why we lived there. Mrs. Gable looked up from her presser when I walked in, her face lighting up with the particular smile she reserved for regulars who actually spoke to her. Mrs. Davies, I have Mr. Davies' suits already. Such beautiful fabric. He must be very successful. He likes to look professional, I said, pulling out my wallet. She disappeared into the back, returning with 5 suits shrouded in plastic. As she rang them up, she tilted her head thoughtfully. I saw him last Tuesday at that fancy club, the Centurion. My nephew is a valet there. Very exclusive place. Tuesday. Charles had called that morning about a client emergency. Said he'd be in depositions all day. Oh, he has a lot of meetings there, I said, my voice carefully neutral. Yes, with that elegant blonde woman. Such a lovely laugh. My nephew says you can hear it across the dining room. Very friendly. Is she his sister? They seem very close. My fingers tightened on my credit card, but I managed a neutral expression. That must be someone from the firm. They often have team lunches. Mrs. Gable nodded, but something in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Every Tuesday, my nephew says. Same table by the window, same woman. Must be a very important client. I signed the receipt, my signature slightly shakier than usual. Charles works with a lot of important people. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk holding $5,000 worth of suits while I processed what Mrs. Gable had unintentionally revealed. Every Tuesday, the same woman. An elegant blonde with a memorable laugh. Charles had worked late every Tuesday for the last 2 months, always with excuses about difficult clients or urgent reports. Back in the apartment, I hung his suits in our closet, each in its designated spot, because Charles insisted on organization. My phone buzzed with a text from Isabel. Can I come over? Robert's at another conference, and I can't stand being alone. She arrived 30 minutes later with coffee and pastries from the expensive bakery Charles always said we couldn't afford. We sat at my small dining table, and I watched her pick apart a croissant without eating any of it. "I need to use your restroom," she said, standing suddenly. Before I could answer, I heard her footsteps not toward the bathroom, but down the hall. "Sophia," she called out, "where do you keep the extra blankets? I'm freezing." "In the hall closet, top shelf," I replied, not thinking about what else was stored there. The sound that followed wasn't quite a scream, more of a sharp intake of breath that seemed to last forever. I found Isabel sitting on the floor of the hallway, surrounded by papers she had accidentally pulled down while reaching for the blankets. Financial statements were scattered around her like fallen leaves, property deeds, investment portfolios, and there, right in front of her, the ownership documents for the Centurion Club, with my name printed clearly at the top. "Sophia," her voice came out strangled. "What is this?" I knelt beside her, gathering the papers with steady hands. "Something Charles doesn't know." "Doesn't know? You own the Centurion Club? The club where Robert and Charles practically live?" "My grandmother left it to me, among other things." Isabel's eyes scanned the documents, her expression shifting from shock to something harder. $80 million. You have $80 million? And Charles doesn't know? He never asked. He assumed I was what I appeared to be. But why? Why hide this? I leaned back against the wall, holding the papers to my chest. My grandmother spent 40 years being invisible in boardrooms while men stole her ideas. I wanted to know if Charles loved me, or the idea of what I could give him. And the Tuesday lunches with an elegant blonde woman. Every week, same table by the window. Isabel's face darkened. That piece of... She stopped herself. Then she looked at me with new comprehension. "You're planning something." "I'm waiting," I corrected. "There's a difference." She helped me return everything to its hiding place, then sat back down at the dining table with a different energy. "You know what? We're both idiots. Hiding who we are, accepting the crumbs they throw at us." Before I could answer, my phone rang. Charles's name flashed on the screen. "Good news," he said, skipping any greeting. "Morgan just called. They've made me a senior partner, youngest in the firm's history." "Congratulations," I began, but he was already continuing. "There's a celebration dinner tomorrow night at the club. Black tie, very exclusive. Morgan says it's for partners only. The wives will have their own event next month. Some kind of tea or something, more suited to your interests." More suited to my interests, as if he had the faintest idea what my interests were. "I understand," I said. "You're not upset, are you? I know you were looking forward to the partners' dinner." I had never expressed the slightest interest in his firm's dinners. He was projecting what he thought I should want, then dismissing it for me. "No, Charles. Enjoy your celebration. You're the best, Sophia. So understanding. Morgan's wife throws a fit about these things, but you get it. You know your place." After he hung up, Isabel stared at me. "You know your place." He actually said that. He says a lot of things. That night, Charles rehearsed his acceptance speech in the bathroom mirror while I lay in our bed, listening through the thin door. He thanked Morgan for his mentorship, Montgomery for the partnership, the mysterious Tuesday woman whom he referred to as Charlotte from Consulting for her invaluable support. Not a single mention of the wife who had worked 2 jobs to put him through law school, who transcribed his briefs when he broke his wrist, who had attended every meaningless firm picnic and pretended his colleagues' stories were interesting. As he delivered his speech to his reflection, I took my car keys and drove to the storage unit across town. Charles thought I couldn't afford a car. He didn't know about the BMW registered to the Prescott Legacy Group, LLC, that I kept for moments when I needed to be myself. The storage unit held everything Charles had never bothered to ask about. My grandmother's furniture, too valuable for our apartment but too meaningful to sell. Boxes of photographs from her years of quietly building an empire. And there, in a trunk that hadn't been opened since her funeral, her leather-bound journal. I sat on the concrete floor and read by the fluorescent light. Her handwriting strong at first, then gradually weakening, documented every slight, every stolen idea, every moment men had taken credit for her brilliance. But alongside the indignities were the triumphs, carefully recorded in financial terms. The first profitable quarter, the first million, the first property, the acquisition of the Centurion Club bought from a man who had laughed at her investment proposals 20 years earlier. The last entry, written a week before she died, made me close the journal and hold it to my chest. Sophia will understand the value of being underestimated. Let them think you are nobody, until the moment you show them you are everything. I drove back from the storage unit with my grandmother's journal on the passenger seat, her words echoing in my mind as I navigated the empty midnight streets. Charles was asleep when I returned, sprawled across our bed in his old Yale Law sweatshirt, taking up 3/4 of the mattress as if, even in his dreams, he needed to claim more than his share. The next morning came like any other, except this time I knew it would be different. I was in the kitchen organizing the pantry, arranging Charles's expensive organic pasta into perfect rows, because he insisted visual organization promoted mental clarity. Behind me, I heard him enter the kitchen, his footsteps carrying the particular weight of someone about to impart what he considered wisdom. He stopped beside the microwave, using its black surface as a mirror to adjust his Hermes tie. The silence stretched between us as I continued to arrange his gluten-free crackers, waiting for whatever complaint he'd prepared for the day. "Don't embarrass me tonight," he said suddenly, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "You're too plain for my wealthy colleagues. Know your place." The can of San Marzano tomatoes in my hand weighed exactly 14.5 ounces, according to its label. I focused on that weight, on the feel of the metal against my palm, on anything but the urge to turn and demonstrate exactly how much damage 14.5 ounces of canned tomatoes could inflict on a head of perfectly coiffed hair. From the living room, I heard Isabel's coffee cup hit its saucer with a sharp clink. She'd heard it all through our paper-thin walls, the ones Charles constantly complained about but refused to move from, because the address was respectable enough for his business cards. "Of course," I said, my voice steady as I placed the can on its designated shelf. "I understand." Charles made a satisfied sound, the kind he produced when a negotiation went his way. He picked up his travel mug of precisely heated coffee and headed for the door, not bothering with a goodbye kiss or even a backward glance. The apartment door clicked shut with its usual protest from the loose hinges he kept promising to fix. Isabel appeared in the kitchen doorway before Charles's footsteps had even faded down the hall. Her face was set with the kind of rage that made her look younger, more like the cousin who used to defend me from playground bullies than the woman whose husband was destroying her with his infidelities. "I'm going after him," she announced, already moving toward the door. That pathetic excuse for a man needs to hear exactly what... I held up a hand and she stopped in her tracks. No, Sophia. He just told you you're too plain for his precious colleagues. I know what he said." I turned from the pantry to face her fully. "This is my battle, Isabel, and it needs to be planned, not reactive." She stood there, vibrating with fury on my behalf, and something in my expression must have communicated what I couldn't yet say aloud. Slowly, she walked to our second-hand sofa, the one Charles deemed an embarrassment, whenever anyone visited, and sank into its worn cushions. "For years," she said, her voice lower now but no less intense. "4 years of this, and you just take it." I sat beside her, feeling the familiar dip of cushions that had supported too many difficult conversations. "Tell me what you see, Isabel. Everything." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Where do I start?" The birthday. He forgot because Morgan needed a 4th for golf. The anniversary dinner he canceled 20 minutes before the reservation because Montgomery wanted to discuss strategy over drinks. Her hands moved as she spoke, painting Charles's failures in the air between us. "The way he introduces you at events, when he actually takes you. This is Sophia. She works in admin," with that little flick of his hand like he's shooing away a fly. Every word landed with precision, confirming what I had recorded in my own mental ledger for years. "He doesn't even see you," Isabel continued. "You're just function to him, someone who keeps his life organized while he chases what he thinks matters." "And what would hurt him the most?" I asked. Isabel's eyes sharpened. "Public humiliation. Complete, undeniable, witnessed by everyone. Charles's entire identity is built on what other people think of him. Take that away." She trailed off, comprehension dawning on her face. "You're going to destroy him. At the club." I pulled out my phone and found the contact I had saved as MT Emergency, Marcus Thorne's private number, given to me by my grandmother with explicit instructions to use it when the time came. My finger hovered over the call button for an instant, and then I pressed. The phone rang twice before a polite, polished voice answered. "Mrs. Davies." I was wondering when you might call. Hello, Marcus. It's about time, if you don't mind me saying. 20 years I worked for your grandmother, and for 3 years I've watched you tolerate that insufferable man in her establishment. You knew Marcus? I've known since his first visit. Your grandmother showed me your photograph every week for her last year. This is Sophia, she'd say. She'll understand when she's ready. A lump formed in my throat, imagining my grandmother, dying, but still planning my future. I'm ready now. Excellent. The partners' dinner is Thursday, I believe. Your husband has requested the Churchill room. He has good taste in rooms he cannot afford. Marcus chuckled softly. Indeed. Let us discuss the arrangements. I assume you will want Philip present? The photographer? The very same. He has captured every significant moment at the club for the last decade. Very discreet, but his images have a way of circulating among the membership. We spent 20 minutes working out the details. The seating arrangement that would place Charles at what he thought was the head of the table, but would actually become a stage for his humiliation. The exact timing to ensure maximum visibility. The specific moment Marcus would make his announcement after the appetizers, but before the main course, when the alcohol had loosened inhibitions but not yet clouded judgment. After I hung up, I looked at Isabel, who had been listening with undisguised glee. I need a dress. You need armor, she corrected, grabbing her keys. And I know exactly where to get it. The drive to Madison Avenue was like crossing between two worlds. Isabel pulled into the valet of a luxury boutique, waving off my protest about the expense, and guided me through doors I'd only ever walked past. The private shopping suite occupied the top floor, accessible only by a special elevator, a space Charles didn't know existed because he'd never thought to look beyond the men's department. I pulled out the American Express Centurion card linked to the Prescott Legacy Group, LLC, the one Charles had never seen, because he'd never asked about the contents of my wallet. The sales associate's eyes widened slightly at the weight and design of the card, titanium, not plastic, with no preset spending limit. How may I help you today? She asked, her entire demeanor shifting to accommodate someone with real money. She needs something that says power, Isabel announced before I could speak. Something that makes every man in a room stand up when she enters. What followed was a transformation that cost more than Charles claimed we had in our life savings. A black Oscar de la Renta gown that looked simple until you noticed the perfect cut, the way it suggested rather than revealed. A pair of Manolo Blahniks that added 4 inches and changed my entire posture. A pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, retrieved from the safety deposit box Charles didn't know existed. Standing before the 3-way mirror, I saw someone else entirely. Not plain Sophia, who organized pantries and accepted insults. This was someone who owned buildings, who controlled destinies, who could destroy a man with a single word. This was the person my grandmother always knew I could become. Isabel dropped me at our building's entrance after our shopping expedition, the luxury bags hidden in her trunk until I could retrieve them later without Charles noticing. The doorman, Mr. Point Wide. Julian gave me his usual nod, unaware that I'd already drafted the paperwork to double his salary once I took ownership of the building next month. Tuesday came with Charles leaving early for what he called strategic planning sessions, but which I now knew were extended lunches with Charlotte Montgomery. I waited until his Uber turned the corner before walking 6 blocks to the office building. Charles had never noticed the one with Prescott Legacy Group, LLC, listed discreetly on the directory between a dental clinic and an accounting firm. My real office occupied half of the 14th floor, a space my grandmother had designed with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she had quietly conquered. Charles believed I spent my Tuesdays at the community college taking courses in Microsoft Office, a fiction he'd created that I'd never corrected. The irony of him explaining Excel functions to me while I managed multi-million-dollar real estate portfolios never ceased to be darkly amusing. I sat at my desk and opened the club's membership database on my computer, the master files that contained far more than just names and addresses. Every incident report, every complaint, every whispered scandal Marcus had documented for 20 years lived in these digital files. My grandmother's insistence on exhaustive record-keeping was now my ammunition. Morgan's file was first. Membership inherited from his father in 1998. The transfer pushed through despite 3 separate violations for what the reports delicately called inappropriate conduct with female staff. 2 settlements paid quietly. a waitress who was transferred to our Palm Beach property after Morgan cornered her in the wine cellar. Charles idolized this man, called him a titan of industry. I made notes on the seating arrangement for Thursday, ensuring Morgan would have the perfect view of his protégé's downfall. Montgomery's record proved even more interesting. His wife, Charlotte, the elegant blonde who lunched with my husband every Tuesday, had spent 2 years campaigning for his membership. The file contained 17 letters, each more desperate than the last, offering escalating donations and promising referrals from other wealthy applicants. He'd finally received approval only after her father, a Supreme Court justice, threatened to investigate our liquor license. Her desperation would serve me well. Reynolds had tried to buy his way in with a $50,000 donation before anyone explained to him that the club didn't accept bribes, only qualifications. His file included a note from Marcus: money but no class. Approved only due to father-in-law's pharmaceutical holdings. Monitor for inappropriate behavior. Thursday would be his last dinner at my club. My phone vibrated with a text from Isabel. "You have to see this. Coming to your office." She arrived 20 minutes later, her face flushed with the thrill of discovery. Without a word, she handed me her phone. Charlotte Montgomery's Instagram account was already open on the screen. The evidence was laid out before me like a map of betrayal. 12 pictures in 6 months, all geotagged at the Centurion Club, and all featuring glimpses of Charles that Charlotte had carefully, but not carefully enough, tried to hide. But I recognized my husband's watch, his hands, the way he held his wine glass with 3 fingers instead of 2. Work lunch with brilliant minds. A caption from 3 weeks ago read, "Charles's sleeve visible at the edge of the frame, discussing futures with someone special." From last month, his reflection caught in her sunglasses. "Some conversations change everything," posted yesterday, his monogrammed cufflinks a gift from me for our anniversary clearly visible as he reached across the table. Isabel methodically screenshotted every picture while I leaned back in my grandmother's leather armchair, the realization finally flooding in. This wasn't about my appearance. Charles hadn't rejected me because I was plain. He had already chosen my replacement. Someone whose husband traveled internationally 3 weeks out of every month. Someone whose desperation for status matched his own. "He's been grooming you," Isabel said quietly. "Look at the progression. The pictures get bolder, the captions more intimate. She's marking her territory. Let her mark all she wants. After Thursday, neither of them will be welcome in any establishment I own." Wednesday was spent in careful preparation. I confirmed the details with Marcus, arranged for Philip to have unrestricted access for photography, and reviewed the presentation Charles had left on our dining table. His proposal for the Mexican executives was good, but not great. It lacked the real estate holdings and international connections that would seal the deal information I possessed, but which he'd never thought to ask about. Thursday dawned gray and damp, the kind of weather that made Charles irritable about his hair. I woke at my usual time, prepared his breakfast with mechanical precision, and listened to him complain about the humidity's effect on his appearance while he ate the eggs I'd made exactly as he liked them. He spent 2 hours getting ready for the dinner, trying on 3 different ties before settling on the Hermes he'd worn to every important meeting for the last year. I sat on our bed with a paperback romance novel, the kind with a shirtless man on the cover that Charles found embarrassing, and watched him practice his presentation in the mirror. "The key," he said to his reflection, "is to make them feel exclusive, like they're joining a select few." I turned a page loudly. He glanced at my book with undisguised disdain. "You should try reading something with substance," he said. "The Economist, perhaps, though I suppose it might be difficult for you to follow." "You're probably right," I said, turning back to my book about a secretary who inherits a fortune and destroys everyone who ever looked down on her. The irony was lost on Charles. He left at 7:30, spending 5 minutes adjusting his appearance in the hall mirror while explaining that these dinners ran late and I shouldn't wait up. The conversation would be about international markets and complex negotiations, things that would bore you. He suggested I order from the Thai place I liked. Maybe watch one of those reality shows that required no intellectual investment. The door closed behind him without a goodbye kiss, a tradition he'd abandoned so long ago I'd forgotten what his lips felt like. 20 minutes later, I was in our bathroom, beginning the ritual my grandmother had taught me during those last few months when she could barely stand but still insisted on attending board meetings. This wasn't about beauty. Charles was right that I was plain. This was about presence, about transforming into someone who commanded attention through power rather than prettiness. The Oscar de la Renta gown slid on like liquid shadow, transforming my body into something architectural. The Manolos changed my posture, forcing my spine straight and my shoulders back. The diamond earrings caught the light like captured stars, the same earrings my grandmother had worn to every meeting where men tried to buy her out, push her aside, or force her out. Isabel arrived to help with my hair, twisting it into the same chignon my grandmother had worn for 40 years of boardroom battles. She handed me the leather portfolio containing the ownership documents, the proof of what Charles had never bothered to discover. The car was waiting downstairs. James at the wheel of the Bentley Charles didn't know existed. When he saw me walk toward the car, his eyes welled up. "Mrs. Sophia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You look just like her, right when she was about to destroy someone." James drove the Bentley up the Centurion Club's private drive with the smooth precision of someone who had performed this maneuver countless times, though never with me in the back seat. Through the tinted windows, I watched the building's facade come into view, limestone and glass rising into the night sky, lit from below with a subtle golden light that made the whole structure seem to glow from within. This was my building, though I had only ever entered through the service entrance on the few occasions I'd needed to sign papers Marcus couldn't bring to my office. 9:15 on the dot, Mrs. Davies, James announced, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Shall I pull up to the main entrance?" "Yes, let them see the car." The Bentley glided to a stop under the portico, where Thomas, the head valet who had worked these doors for 15 years, stood at attention the moment he saw the license plate. Prescott 1. My grandmother's personal designation. His entire posture changed. His usual efficient movements became almost reverential as he reached for my door handle. "Miss Prescott," he breathed, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Davies, welcome to the club." The correction of the last name hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. Every senior staff member knew the Prescott name, knew the stories of my grandmother's monthly inspections, her exacting standards, her ability to know every employee by name despite running an empire. They had been waiting 3 years to see if I would ever claim my inheritance publicly. I stepped out of the Bentley, the click of my heels on the portico's marble announcing my arrival like a drum roll. Through the glass doors, I could see the lobby staff trying to maintain professional composure, while craning for a better view of the woman they only knew from signatures on paychecks and glimpses of legal documents. Robert, the head concierge who had started as a bellhop under my grandmother, approached with measured steps that couldn't quite conceal his urgency. His usual impeccable composure showed cracks, a slight tremor in his hands, his eyes bright with something between excitement and vindication. "Mrs. Davies," he said, his voice layered with 40 years of hospitality experience. "Everything has been arranged to your specifications. The Churchill room is prepared, the staff has been briefed, and Mr. Thorne awaits your arrival in the observatory lounge." "And my husband?" Robert's expression shifted minutely, professional discretion warring with personal opinion. "Mr. Davies arrived 30 minutes ago with the partners from his firm. He is currently entertaining the delegation from Mexico." The pause before entertaining told me everything. I could picture Charles, holding court 3 drinks deep into his performance, playing the part of the power broker in my establishment, while the real power stood in the lobby in designer heels. "Charlotte Montgomery?" I asked. Seated at Mr. Davies' immediate right, her proximity has been noted by several of the other partners' wives. Of course it had. Charlotte's desperate social climbing was as subtle as a neon sign, and the wives of the Centurion Club had spent decades perfecting the art of cataloging inappropriate behavior for future ammunition. I walked through the lobby, my heels creating a rhythm against the marble that seemed to draw every eye in the space. The night manager, Sarah, actually did a small curtsy, an involuntary dip she immediately tried to turn into a gesture for something on her desk. 2 waiters carrying trays of champagne stopped in their tracks to watch me pass. The entire atmosphere shifted, as if the building itself recognized its true owner had finally arrived. The observatory lounge occupied a mezzanine that overlooked the main dining rooms through specially treated glass. You could see out, but no one could see in. Marcus Thorne stood near the windows, his silver hair catching the soft lighting as he watched the Churchill room below. "Punctual as always," he said without turning. Your grandmother would be pleased. I joined him at the window, looking down at the scene unfolding in my private dining room. The Churchill room was the jewel of the club circular, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, a baccarat crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's annual salary, and a table that could seat 20, but tonight held only 12. Charles sat in what he believed was the head of the table, his back to the door, a position that would have made my grandmother laugh. Never sit with your back to the entrance, she'd taught me. That's how you don't see your enemies coming. He was gesticulating expansively with his champagne flute, his face flushed with alcohol and self-importance. The Mexican executives, Mr. Garza, Mr. Trevino, and Mrs. Valdez, according to my files, maintained expressions of polite interest that didn't quite hide their boredom. They had heard this pitch before, or versions of it, from dozens of American firms trying to break into Latin American markets without understanding the culture. Morgan sat to Charles's left, his face already ruddy from wine, occasionally interjecting with comments that Charles would then expand on as if they were his own ideas. Montgomery was hunched over his phone, typing with the focused intensity of someone managing a crisis, likely one related to his wife's increasingly obvious attraction to my husband. Charlotte Montgomery had positioned herself as close to Charles as social decorum allowed. Her chair was angled toward him, her body language screaming availability to anyone with eyes. Every few seconds she would touch his arm, his shoulder, the back of his chair, each contact lasting an instant too long to be casual. Her wedding ring, a gaudy display of diamonds her husband had bought to compensate for his absences, caught the light with every gesture. Reynolds sat at the far end, excluded from the main conversation but laughing too loudly at every joke, desperate to be included in a circle that would never fully accept him. His wife, a nervous woman who looked like she would rather be anywhere else, clutched her purse in her lap and said nothing. Your husband is on his 4th glass of champagne, Marcus observed clinically. His presentation skills tend to deteriorate after the 3rd. Let him drink. In vino veritas. Marcus pulled out his iPad, swiping through screens with practiced efficiency. The photographer's punero is positioned in the southeast corner. He has clear angles of the entire table. The staff is instructed to serve the appetizer at 9:00, the main course at 9:45. Your entrance is scheduled for 9:15 after the appetizers, but before the conversation turns fully to business. He showed me another screen. The membership records of everyone at the table, their violations, their payments, their secrets, all cataloged in my grandmother's meticulous system. Reynolds has 2 violations this month alone, Marcus pointed out, both related to inappropriate comments to female staff. His membership is already under review. After tonight, it won't matter. Down below, Charles stood, raising his champagne flute for what appeared to be a toast. Even through the soundproof glass, I could see his mouth forming words, his free hand gesturing to encompass the room, the moment, his imagined triumph. He is toasting the future, Marcus translated, reading his lips with the skill of someone who has spent decades in hospitality, to partnerships that transcend borders, to a success that lesser men can only dream of. Lesser men. The phrase burned in my chest, fuel for what was about to happen. Mrs. Valdez speaks perfect English, Marcus continued. Though she has been politely feigning otherwise to avoid Charles's attempts at conversation, Mr. Garza and Mr. Trevino have already decided to pass on the proposal. Their translator informed me they are only staying out of courtesy. Charles sat down to the applause of his colleagues, basking in their approval while Charlotte whispered something in his ear that made him smile, the kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in 2 years. Marcus closed his iPad and turned to face me fully. Your grandmother once told me that revenge is a dish best served not cold, but at the exact right temperature. Too soon and it lacks impact. Too late and it loses its meaning. And tonight, he paused, tonight is perfectly calibrated. At precisely 9:10, Charles stood again, champagne glass aloft for another toast. Through the glass, I watched him perform for his audience, unaware that his real audience was 1 floor up, observing him like a cat watches a mouse that doesn't yet know it's trapped. Marcus checked his watch. 5 minutes, Mrs. Davies. I nodded once, and he turned toward the dining room doors to begin the final act of Charles's public life as he knew it. Marcus moved away from my side with the measured steps of someone approaching a lit fuse, knowing the explosion was inevitable, but maintaining professional composure. I watched from my position just outside the dining room doors as he navigated the seated guests with practiced precision, approaching Morgan's chair with the gravity of a bailiff delivering a verdict. The whisper he delivered into Morgan's ear was brief, perhaps 5 seconds, but Morgan's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His face lost color so quickly I thought he might faint. Then he shot to his feet with such force that his chair tipped backward, crashing against the credenza with a sound that made everyone jump. His wine glass, forgotten in his hand, tilted precariously before he set it down with trembling fingers. Montgomery, seeing his managing partner's reaction, scrambled to his feet without knowing why a lifetime of hierarchical conditioning, making him mimic the actions of his superiors. Then Reynolds, desperate to never be left out, rose so fast he knocked his knee against the table, rattling the crystal. The other partners followed in a wave, each man standing because the man next to him had stood, none yet understanding what had prompted this sudden show of respect. Only Charles remained seated, a confused half-smile on his face, the look of someone who has missed the punchline. He glanced from Morgan to Montgomery, to the now standing executives, his mouth opening to ask what was happening, when Morgan reached down and literally hauled him to his feet by his arm, yanking him up with a surprising strength for a man who spent his days behind a desk. "What's going on?" Charles's voice had that irritated edge he used when things didn't proceed according to his script. Marcus's voice filled the Churchill room with the kind of clarity that comes from decades of commanding attention in spaces designed for power. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Sophia Prescott, owner and chairwoman of the Prescott Legacy Group and proprietor of the Centurion Club." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Even the waiters, trained to be invisible, were frozen mid-motion. The only sound was the sharp intake of breath from Charlotte Montgomery, a gasp that seemed to last an eternity. I pushed open the doors and entered my domain. Every click of my heels against the Italian marble counted down the seconds of Charles's old life. I didn't rush. This moment, this walk, this revelation had been 4 years in the making, and I would savor every second. The Oscar de la Renta gown moved with me like liquid shadow. The diamonds at my ears caught the light from the baccarat chandelier above, casting tiny rainbows on the walls. Charles's face began its transformation in real time, a masterclass in psychological collapse that I observed with the detached fascination of a scientist watching an experiment. First came confusion, his brows furrowing as he tried to process why everyone was standing for his plain wife, the one he'd told to know her place just days ago. Then came recognition, his eyes widening as they took in the dress, the shoes, the jewelry, all of it worth more than he claimed we had in our life savings. Finally came the horror, that dawning, soul-crushing realization as his brain finally connected Marcus's words to the woman walking toward him. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. He looked like a fish out of water, gasping for something that was no longer available to him. His hand reached for his champagne flute, missed, and knocked it over, the golden liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like a prophecy. Charlotte Montgomery's reaction was nearly as satisfying. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat in a gesture that would have seemed theatrical if it weren't so genuine. The color drained from her face, leaving her expensive makeup looking like a mask against pale skin. She took a half step back, then another, trying to put distance between herself and the catastrophe she had helped create. Marcus pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one Charles had been occupying with such authority moments before. I sat with the deliberate grace my grandmother had drilled into me during long afternoons in her study, when she made me practice sitting and standing until my muscles ached. The chair received me like a throne, accepting its rightful occupant. Charles remained frozen until Morgan, operating on some primitive understanding of hierarchy, shoved him toward a side chair, the one usually reserved for junior associates or plus ones, not deemed worthy of a proper placement. My husband, the senior partner who had spent the evening boasting of his connections and influence, sat down heavily in his designated spot on the periphery of power. Morgan's mouth moved, trying to form words, apologies, explanations, anything to fill the terrible silence. "Mrs. Davies, Prescott, we had no idea. Charles never mentioned. We would have—" I held up a hand, a simple gesture that stopped him mid-babble. The power in that moment, the ability to silence a room full of men who considered themselves masters of the universe, was intoxicating. I turned instead to the Mexican executives, who were watching with barely concealed fascination. Mrs. Valdez had dropped her pretense of not speaking English, her eyes sharp with interest. Mr. Gaja and Mr. Trevino exchanged a look that suggested this was far more entertaining than any proposal they had come to hear. Mr. Garza, Mr. Trevino, Mrs. Valdez, I said, my voice carrying the authority I had hidden under years of manufactured submission. My apologies for the confusion. Shall we discuss the real business proposal? I believe my husband's presentation, while enthusiastic, lacks certain essential details regarding our holdings in Miami, our partnership with the Tanaka Group in Panama, and the development rights we hold in Marbella. Mr. Garza's eyebrows rose slightly, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all night. You have holdings in Miami? 3 commercial properties in Brickell, 2 in South Beach, all acquired through the Prescott Legacy Group in the last 18 months. I pulled out my phone, swiping to the property portfolio I had memorized. Our occupancy rate is 97%, with waiting lists for all premium spaces. Charles made a sound, not quite a word, more like air escaping a punctured tire. I continued, ignoring him. Marcus appeared at my side with the iPad, the membership database already open. I took it with a nod of thanks, making a show of scrolling through the names as the table watched in silent horror. Let's see, I said, my tone conversational, as if reviewing a grocery list instead of determining social fates. Morgan, current status, 3 violations for inappropriate conduct with staff. Approved to continue membership despite these infractions. Interesting. Morgan's ruddy face turned purple. Those were misunderstandings. I'm sure they were. I continued scrolling. Montgomery. Membership approved after a 2-year waiting period. His wife, Charlotte, was quite persistent. 17 letters, if I recall. Such determination. Charlotte made a small whimpering sound, shrinking in her chair as if she could disappear through sheer force of will. Reynolds, I continued, attempted to donate $50,000 to expedite membership. When informed we do not accept bribes, his father-in-law threatened to review our licensing agreements. A creative approach to networking. Reynolds's mouth worked open and shut with no sound, his usual nervous laugh completely absent. I set the iPad down and looked directly at Charles for the first time since I'd entered. His face had gone gray, the kind of color that suggested either an imminent cardiac event or a complete psychological collapse. Charles Davies, I said, letting his name hang in the air like an indictment. Current membership status. Under review. Under review? His voice cracked on the words. Marcus stepped forward. We have standards at the club, Mr. Davies. Partners who embarrass their spouses, who describe them as too plain for polite company, who suggest they should know their place. Well, such behavior indicates a deficit of character incompatible with our values. Charles's chair scraped against the marble floor, a sound like nails on a chalkboard, as he shot to his feet. His face was blotchy with a combination of alcohol and desperation, his hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough to turn his knuckles white. And when he spoke, his voice carried the forced authority of someone trying to wrestle back control of an uncontrollable situation. Sophia, we need to discuss this in private. Now. I continued scrolling through the membership database on the iPad, not bothering to look at him. The dismissal was deliberate, calculated to demonstrate the shift in the power dynamic to everyone watching. You wanted me to know my place, darling, I said, my voice laced with the same casual cruelty he had used to deliver those words. This is my place. It just so happens to include every building you've spent 3 years trying to impress people in. Charles turned to Morgan, then to Montgomery, his hands gesturing wildly as he tried to salvage something from the wreckage. This is clearly a misunderstanding. I had no idea Sophia had any connection to the club. She never mentioned, "So you're incompetent." Morgan's voice cut through Charles's babbling. You lived with the owner of the most exclusive club in the city for 4 years and you never knew? Charles's face flushed an even deeper red. She deceived me. She lied about who she was. Or, I said, finally looking up from the iPad, you never asked. You assumed I was exactly what you wanted me to be, someone lesser who made you feel superior. Someone too plain for your sophisticated world. Charlotte Montgomery chose that moment to attempt her escape. She rose from her chair with practiced grace, pressing a hand to her forehead in a gesture of distress that might have been convincing if her eyes weren't darting toward the exit like a trapped animal. "I'm feeling faint," she announced to no one in particular. "The heat. Perhaps I should—" "Charlotte," I called out, my voice sweet as honey laced with arsenic. "Leaving so soon? But you haven't told everyone about your Tuesday lunches with my husband." She froze mid-step, her designer heel hovering above the floor. Those Instagram posts were so revealing. Work lunch with brilliant minds, discussing futures with someone special. Some conversations change everything. All tagged at the club, all during Charles's supposed client emergencies. I held up my phone. The screenshots Isabel had taken already loaded. 12 pictures in 6 months. "Your husband, Javier, is still in Dubai, isn't he? He returns tomorrow, I believe. I'm sure he'd be fascinated to hear about these business discussions." The sound Charlotte made wasn't quite a word, more like air being squeezed from a balloon. Her husband, seated 3 seats away, had gone rigid, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and rage in the span of seconds. Montgomery's eyes darted between his wife and Charles with the dawning comprehension of a man who'd been too focused on his phone to notice his marriage dissolving in front of him. Javier Montgomery's voice was dangerously quiet. "Tuesday, lunches? It's not we were discussing Charles was helping with—" Her explanations tangled and died as she realized there was no innocent explanation for 12 documented meetings her husband knew nothing about. Mr. Garza, who had been watching this drama unfold with the detached interest of someone enjoying live theater, cleared his throat delicately. He turned to face me directly, offering a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Mrs. Prescott," he said in perfect English, dropping all pretense of needing translation. "Your Miami properties interest us far more than your husband's proposals. Perhaps we could discuss exclusive use of the club for our American operations," I replied in fluent, culturally attuned Spanish, watching as Charles's jaw dropped. "Of course, Mr. Garza. Our company is already deeply involved in the Latin American market." Mr. Trevino and Mrs. Valdez exchanged impressed glances. Mrs. Valdez took out her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she pulled up what looked like financial projections. "You speak like one of us," Charles said, the words coming out strangled. 3 years of business Spanish classes while you thought I was at the community college," I replied, switching back to English. "Tuesday and Thursday mornings. You never asked which classes I was taking." I turned my full attention to the Mexican executives, continuing the negotiation in Spanish with a fluency that sealed their respect, while Charles sat in stunned silence, a spectator to a conversation that was dismantling his professional future. In 3 minutes, we had outlined the framework for a $40 million exclusive partnership that would give their company a permanent space at the club and first right of refusal on 3 of my Miami commercial properties. Morgan tried to interject something about the existing proposal from Davies and Associates, but Mr. Garza waved him off with a polite but firm gesture. "We prefer to work with partners who value transparency," Mr. Garza said, looking directly at Charles, "and who understand that respect in personal relationships is a reflection of professional capabilities." The deal Charles had been chasing for 6 months, the one that would have secured his path to managing partner, evaporated in less time than it takes to serve dessert. I stood, smoothing down my dress with deliberate calm, and looked at my husband one last time. "Marcus," I said, and the general manager stepped forward immediately. "Please process the termination of Mr. Davies' membership tonight, effective immediately." "No!" Charles's protest came out as almost a shriek. "You can't do this. I pay $40,000 a year for that membership." "You paid," I corrected. "Past tense. Your final dues will be prorated as of today." "This is vengeful. This is business," I interrupted. "The same kind of business you've been conducting while telling me I was too plain to understand it." Marcus pulled out his phone, typing quickly. "Security will meet you at the locker room if you have any personal items to collect, Mr. Davies. Your access has been revoked as of—" He checked his screen. 9:47 p.m. The partners who had spent the evening celebrating Charles's success now physically edged away from him, their bodies angling toward the door as if his failure might be contagious. Morgan had, in fact, taken 3 full steps backward. Montgomery was still staring at his wife with undisguised fury. Reynolds had somehow managed to sidle almost completely out of the room. Philip, the photographer who had been documenting club events for a decade, moved through the chaos with practiced invisibility, his camera capturing every moment. Charles's devastation as he realized his world had collapsed. Morgan's desperate attempt to distance himself from his protégé. Charlotte's tears as her husband collected his coat and left without a word. The Mexican executive shaking my hand with genuine respect. And through it all, I stood at the head of the table in my grandmother's diamonds, no longer plain, no longer hidden, no longer willing to know any place that wasn't my own. "Gentlemen," I said to the room at large, though most were already fleeing, "I believe dinner is concluded." The Churchill room emptied in minutes, executives scurrying like rats from a sinking ship, leaving behind half-eaten meals and abandoned dignity. I remained at the head of the table, watching the exodus with the detached calm of someone who had already won the war. Marcus stood beside me, hands clasped behind his back, witnessing the aftermath of what would become a club legend. 3 days later, I sat in Howard Nathanson's office, the attorney my grandmother had entrusted with her empire, and watched Charles sign the divorce papers with a hand that trembled slightly. He looked smaller, somehow, sitting across from me in a suit that fit more loosely than it had a week ago. His face had the hollow look of someone who has had their entire identity stripped away. The prenuptial agreement he had insisted on before our wedding lay between us, the document he had presented so proudly, explaining how it would protect his future earnings from a spouse who might try to take advantage. He never asked if I had any assets to protect. The irony was lost on neither of us now, as he signed away any claim to my $80 million inheritance. "The contents of the apartment are specified here," Howard said, sliding another page across. "Mr. Davies retains his clothing, his personal electronics, and the furniture he brought into the marriage." Charles's jaw tightened at the word "retains," as if being allowed to keep his own belongings was some kind of concession I was granting him. He signed without reading. He was past the point of fighting for anything. "I have an offer," he said quietly, not meeting my eye. "A small firm in Cleveland. They don't care what happened." "Good," I said, and I meant it. In spite of everything, I didn't want him utterly destroyed, just removed from my life and properly humbled. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Did you ever love me?" "I loved who I thought you were. You loved who you thought I should be. Neither of us loved who we actually were." He left without another word. The last I saw of Charles Davies, he was loading boxes into a U-Haul while our neighbors pretended not to watch. The story of his public humiliation had spread through every social circle that mattered. Mrs. Albright from 4B, who had always been a little too polite to Charles, brought out a pitcher of fresh lemonade for the residents gathered to witness his departure, turning his moving day into an impromptu and very satisfying block party. That evening, Isabel insisted on taking me to lunch at the club to celebrate. Walking through those doors as myself, no pretense of being anything other than the owner, felt like taking a free breath for the first time in years. The staff didn't quite know how to act. Some bowed, others clapped. Thomas, the valet, actually wiped a tear from his eye when he saw me. We sat in the main dining room, not the Churchill room with its recent memories, and Marcus personally selected a bottle of champagne from the cellar. "Dom Perignon, 1,996, he announced with ceremony, presenting it like a sacrament. "That's a $3,000 bottle," I protested. "It was your grandmother's favorite," he replied. "She could never afford it during her secretarial years, but she bought a case the day she closed the deal on the club. She said one day her granddaughter would drink it in celebration." Isabel raised her glass once Marcus had poured, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have a confession," she said. "I knew about your inheritance the whole time." The champagne flute stopped halfway to my lips. "What?" "Grandma Valentina told me in the hospital, those last weeks when you were at work and I would sit with her during the day. She made me promise to look out for you, but to never tell you about the money. Sophia needs to learn this lesson on her own," she said. "Being underestimated is only a weapon if you learn how to wield it." I thought of all those times Isabel had bitten her tongue, watching Charles belittle me, knowing I could buy and sell him 10 times over. That must have been torture. Hardest thing I've ever done. But she was right. You had to find your own power, in your own time. We toasted my grandmother's memory with the champagne she dreamed of drinking when men called her sweetheart and asked her to fetch coffee while they stole her ideas. In the months that followed, I remade my life on my own terms. I kept our small apartment but bought the entire building not for profit but for purpose. The first project of the Valentina Prescott Foundation was turning it into affordable housing for women leaving bad marriages. Women who needed what I'd had, time to discover their own worth. I still shopped at Zara when I felt like it. I still used coupons from the Sunday paper because my grandmother taught me that wealth without wisdom breeds poverty. The habits of frugality she had instilled in me were no longer about necessity, but about remembering where power truly comes from. Not money, but understanding value. When I entered the club now, everyone stood not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine respect. I had earned my place through revelation rather than inheritance. At business forums where I spoke about real estate development and women's economic independence, young women took notes while their male bosses tried to pretend they hadn't dismissed me as Charles's plain wife at dozens of events. Morgan approached me at one such forum, his face carrying the permanent flush of embarrassment he'd worn since that night in the Churchill room. "Mrs. Prescott, I just want to apologize again for—" "Stop. You've apologized 17 times by my count. Either you actually mean it and change, or stop saying it." He nodded and scurried away, but I noticed later that he had promoted 2 female associates that week. Charlotte Montgomery vanished from the social scene entirely after her husband filed for divorce. Last I heard, she was working in a boutique in Palm Beach, selling handbags to women who didn't know her story. Her replacement on various charity committees took careful notes whenever I spoke, having learned the value of paying attention to quiet women. On the first anniversary of my revelation at the club, I finally opened the envelope my grandmother's lawyer had given me with strict instructions to wait until I understood. The paper inside was thin, her handwriting shaky but determined. "My dearest Sophia," it began, "being plain is not about faces or fashion. It is about letting others reveal themselves while you quietly build your empire. They never see us coming because they never truly see us. Men like your Charles and, yes, I knew what he was the moment you introduced him, mistake visibility for value, use their blindness, build your power, then rise in your truth and watch them kneel." At the very bottom in handwriting so shaky I could barely read it, "P.S. that Charles is a jackass. Destroy him with elegance." I had the letter professionally framed and hung it above my desk in the Prescott Legacy Group office, where every visiting executive could read it. More than one had stood before it, the color draining from his face, as he wondered who in his life he might have underestimated. The frame shop owner, a woman in her 60s named Dorothy, had read it while mounting it and said quietly, "Your grandmother sounds like someone who understood the long game." She understood that being underestimated was just another form of armor, I'd replied. Dorothy smiled. "The best kind. The one they never see until it's too late." Now, a year later, I stand in that same office, looking out at the city my grandmother conquered in silence, and which I now govern openly. Being plain was never about beauty. It was about being invisible enough to see everything, while revealing nothing, until the perfect moment. Charles had been right about one thing. I was too plain for his world. But his world was small, built on appearances and approval. My world, my grandmother's world, was built on patience, power, and the perfect time to reveal that the plainest faces often hide the sharpest minds.